The town of Sagebrush Flats did not wake gently. It rose each morning with the groan of wagon wheels on dry earth, the clatter of iron horseshoes against stone, and the smell of wood smoke curling from a dozen chimneys before the sun had properly cleared the eastern ridge. It was a town built by stubborn hands, by people who had looked at an unforgiving land and decided, against all reasonable judgment, to stay. By 1882, it had grown into something almost respectable. It had a church, a post office, a general store with a crooked sign, and enough gossip to fill 3 newspapers, though it only had one. Minsa Caldwell had lived at the edge of that town for 4 years, and in those 4 years she had learned 2 things about Sagebrush Flats. The first was that the sunsets were extraordinary, wide and burning, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose that no painter back east could ever truly replicate. The second was that the town had a long memory and a short supply of kindness for women who did not marry on schedule. She was 25 years old. To those who looked carelessly, Minsa was simply the eldest Caldwell daughter, the quiet one, the serious one, the one who carried water from the well before her stepsisters had opened their eyes in the morning. But those who looked carefully, and very few did, would have noticed something else entirely. They would have noticed the steadiness in her dark eyes, the way she listened when others spoke as though their words genuinely mattered, the unconscious grace with which she moved through even the most ordinary tasks. They would have noticed that she was, in the truest and least fashionable sense of the word, beautiful. The Caldwell family had not always lived in frontier dust. Her father, Reginald Caldwell, had once held a respected name back east, a merchant of modest nobility, a man with a polished coat and a pocket watch that chimed on the hour. But bad investments and worse luck had stripped the family of its standing, and when Minsa was 21, Reginald had packed what remained of their dignity into 3 trunks and moved them west, chasing the promise that frontier land rewarded fresh starts. He had died 2 years later, leaving Minsa with a small homestead, an ailing stepmother named Clara, and 2 stepsisters who had inherited their mother's talent for decorative living. Dora was 22. Lillian was 20. They were pretty in the way that certain wildflowers were pretty, bright, uncomplicated, and entirely suited to being admired. They laughed easily, danced willingly, and understood instinctively that the frontier, for all its roughness, still contained men who wanted soft and lovely things. By the spring of 1882, they had each found one. Dora married Hector Prout, owner of the largest cattle ranch in the valley, a broad-shouldered man with sun-cracked hands and a genuine fondness for his new wife. Lillian married Roland Sieves, a land baron from the Northern Territory who wore his wealth quietly but unmistakably, the way a river wears its depth. The double wedding was held on a Saturday in April and was the single most discussed event in Sagebrush Flats that entire year. Minsa stood beside them at the ceremony in a dress she had sewn herself, cream-colored, carefully stitched, pressed the night before with a hot iron. She smiled throughout. She held Lillian's bouquet when asked. She caught the eye of her stepmother across the aisle and offered a small, reassuring nod. Later, when the dancing began and the lanterns were lit and couples swayed beneath a sky thick with stars, Minsa sat at the edge of the celebration with a cup of cold cider and watched the world pair itself off around her. She was not bitter. Bitterness required a kind of surrender she had never been willing to make. But she was not untouched, either. She was human, and humans feel the weight of things, even when they refuse to be crushed by them. The whispers had begun before the rice was swept from the church steps. Both younger ones married first. Doesn't that tell you something? Pretty enough face, but too bookish. Men want warmth, not a library. She'll end up minding that homestead alone. Shame, really. Minsa heard them all. She returned home that evening, changed into her work clothes, and spent an hour in her garden by lamplight, pulling weeds that had grown bold in her absence. There was something honest about the soil. It did not gossip. It simply waited to see what you would grow. It was 3 days after the wedding that Joseph Calloway rode into Sagebrush Flats. He arrived at dusk, which suited him. He was the kind of man who arrived at dusk, tall in the saddle, dark-coated, with a stillness about him that was not peace but something that had been hammered into the shape of peace through long and difficult years. His horse was a gray mare named in no record anywhere, and his eyes were the color of creek water in November, cool, deep, and not easily read. The town noticed him immediately and said nothing, which was the most respect Sagebrush Flats ever paid to anyone. He met with Sheriff Dale Boone that same evening. The sheriff had written to the marshal's office 2 weeks prior requesting assistance. The Denton gang, 7 men led by a calculating and violent outlaw named Cray Denton, had been moving through the valley, intimidating homesteaders, burning what they couldn't steal. The law needed weight behind it. Joseph was that weight. The following morning, he was sworn in as deputy marshal. As he left the sheriff's office and turned his collar up against a sharp wind, a sound reached him from across the road, a calm voice, steady and low, speaking gently to a frightened man slumped against the trough outside the doctor's office. A traveler badly bruised, clearly having met with misfortune on the road. The calm voice belonged to a woman kneeling beside him in a cream-colored work dress, pressing a clean cloth to a wound on the man's temple, speaking to him the way one speaks to a spooked horse, quietly, without fear, without fuss. Joseph stopped walking. He stood and watched for a moment longer than he intended to. Then he put his hat back on, turned away, and told himself it meant nothing. He was not a man who was easily convinced by his own lies. Spring in the valley did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, cautiously, the way good things often do. A degree of warmth added each morning. A little more color pressed into the hills each week, until one day you looked up and realized the world had quietly, completely changed around you. The wildflowers came first along the creek bed, then the grass on the lower slopes turned from pale gold to green, and the garden beside the Caldwell homestead, which Minsa had been tending since the last frost with the patience of someone who understood that worthy things require time, began to show its first honest growth. She was on her knees in that garden the first time Joseph stopped. He did not stop for long. He was riding the Valley Patrol, a wide circuit that Sheriff Boone had mapped out to cover the homesteads most vulnerable to Denton's movements. The Caldwell property sat at the southeastern edge of the route, modest and well-kept, the kind of place that showed the character of the person maintaining it. He told himself he stopped because the gate latch needed attention. It did need attention, it was true. But he fixed it without being asked, without announcing himself, and was back in the saddle before Minsa had fully straightened from the soil. She noticed, though. She noticed the way quiet people always notice things completely and without comment. The following week, she left a tin cup of cold water on the fence post nearest the road. It was gone the next morning. This was how it began between them, not with words, not with any of the performative courtship rituals that Sagebrush Flats considered normal, but with small and honest gestures that said, plainly and without decoration, "I see you. You are not invisible here." For two people who had each spent considerable portions of their lives being looked through rather than looked at, this was more significant than most declarations. The conversations came gradually. A nod became a pause became a sentence. A sentence eventually became an hour on the porch steps while the sun dropped behind the ridge and the valley filled with the particular golden silence of a frontier evening. Joseph was not a natural talker. He had spent too many years in places where words were either unnecessary or dangerous, and he had lost the habit of them in company. But Minsa did not need him to fill every silence. She was comfortable with quiet in a way that he found, to his own great surprise, deeply restful. She told him about her life back east, the pocket watch her father carried, the smell of the old house after rain, the strange grief of losing a world that had already been diminishing before it was fully gone. He listened the way he did everything, with his complete attention, his eyes steady, his hands still. In return, and slowly, he told her things he had not told anyone. That he had been 17 when he first put on a gun. That he had ridden with men he was not proud of before he found his way to the right side of a badge. That he had never in his life planted anything, fixed anything, built anything, only arrived at places already broken and dealt with the breaking. Minsa had looked at him then with those steady, dark eyes and said, without sentimentality, "A man who chooses to be good despite everything is the finest kind." He had looked away. Something in his jaw tightened the way it did when a thing struck him somewhere unguarded. It was in the third week of May that Dora and Lillian arrived at the homestead with their husbands in tow, Hector Prout in a new coat, Roland Sieves stepping down from a lacquered carriage that had no business on a dirt road. They had come ostensibly to visit Clara, whose health had been declining through the season, but the visit had the unmistakable texture of a display. Dora wore a brooch that caught the sunlight aggressively. Lillian mentioned the new furniture twice before she reached the door. Minsa served them tea. She asked after their homes, their comfort, their happiness, and she meant every question genuinely. But when Lillian pressed her hand and said with soft, terrible pity, "Dear Minsa, you really must let us introduce you to someone, anyone. It isn't right you being out here alone," Minsa felt the words settle into her chest like stones dropped into still water. She smiled. She refilled the teacups. She did not let a single stone show on her surface. Joseph had arrived at the gate mid-visit on his afternoon circuit. He had taken in the lacquered carriage, the coats, the particular arrangement of people on the porch, and he had understood the entire architecture of the situation in the time it took him to dismount. He remained by the fence, checking his horse's shoe with great thoroughness, for longer than any shoe required checking. When the visitors finally departed in a cloud of dust and self-satisfaction, Minsa stood at the gate watching them go. She was not aware that her shoulders had drawn slightly inward, the only sign she ever permitted herself. Joseph was beside her. He said nothing. He simply stood there, present and solid, until her shoulders returned to their natural position. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The crisis came on a Tuesday in June without warning, as crises prefer to do. A ranch hand rode hard into Sagebrush Flats with word that Denton's gang had been seen moving south toward the valley's eastern homesteads. That same evening, a note was found nailed to Minsa's fence post. It was unsigned, but its meaning was clear. She had sheltered the Rourke family 2 weeks prior, a family Denton had been using for leverage, and she had been seen doing it. That night Minsa sat at her kitchen table with a lamp burning low, reading without reading, listening to the dark outside. At midnight she heard a horse settle quietly near the gate. She looked through the window and saw the shadow of a man still, watchful, his back to the house and his face to the road. She did not go out. She did not need to. She simply turned the lamp a little higher, so he would know she knew he was there, and returned to her book with hands that had, at last, stopped trembling. Outside, Joseph Calloway pulled his coat against the night air, checked the road in both directions, and stayed until morning. The morning Cray Denton rode into Sagebrush Flats. The sky was the color of an old bruise, purple and gray at the edges, with a thin line of pale light along the eastern horizon that had not yet decided whether it intended to become a sunrise. The town felt it before it saw it. Dogs went quiet. Horses shifted in their stalls. The particular silence that precedes violence settled over the main street like a held breath. Denton came with 6 men. They rode in a loose line, unhurried, with the confidence of people who had never been made to hurry by anything. Denton himself was lean and weathered, with pale eyes that moved constantly and a mouth that rested in a thin, satisfied line. He had burned 3 homesteads in the northern valley the previous month and considered it unremarkable work. He had come to Sagebrush Flats to make a point that no sheriff, no badge, and no deputy marshal imported from the territorial office could alter the fundamental fact of his authority in this valley. He had not yet met Joseph Calloway face to face. Joseph was standing in the middle of the main street when they arrived. He stood alone, initially coat open, hat low, hands at his sides, with the particular relaxed readiness of a man who had been in enough of these moments to stop being frightened by them. Sheriff Boone emerged from the office doorway with 2 deputies flanking him, taking positions on the boardwalk. The street was otherwise empty. Word had moved fast, and the town had pulled itself indoors with the practiced efficiency of people who understood what a gathering storm looked like. Denton pulled his horse to a stop 30 feet from Joseph and looked down at him with those restless pale eyes. "You'd be the marshal they sent," Denton said. "Deputy marshal," Joseph replied, as though the distinction mattered, as though they were simply clarifying a clerical matter on a quiet afternoon. "You'd be done." What followed lasted less than 2 minutes, which was longer than such things usually lasted when Joseph was involved. Denton reached first, a decision he had made and could not unmake, and the street erupted with sound and smoke and motion. Sheriff Boone and his deputies moved from the boardwalk. 2 of Denton's men dropped their weapons immediately at the sight of the law converging. 2 more tried their luck and found it absent. Denton himself, who was faster than he looked and more desperate than he had appeared, managed to fire once before Joseph's shot found its mark, not fatal, carefully placed, dropping Denton from the saddle and into the dust where he belonged. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. Clean, settled. The kind of silence that comes after a long and ugly noise has finally, permanently, stopped. Joseph stood in the settling dust and became aware, in the way one becomes aware of such things only after the danger has passed, that his left shoulder was burning. Denton's single shot had grazed it, a shallow wound, more insult than injury, but bleeding with the cheerful indifference that even minor wounds tend to manage. He pressed his right hand to it, looked at the blood on his fingers with mild displeasure, and said nothing. It was Minsa who reached him first. She had come into town that morning to collect Clara's medicine from the general store, an errand timed by necessity, not choice, and had been sheltering inside the store when the confrontation unfolded. The moment the street fell quiet, she was through the door, moving with the same unhurried purpose she brought to everything, her supply of clean cloth already in her hands, with the practical foresight of a woman who had learned that the world regularly required clean cloth. She reached him and looked at the shoulder and said, "Sit down, Joseph." He sat down on the horse trough without argument, which was, for a man of his nature, essentially a declaration. She worked quickly and cleanly, the way he had first watched her work on that battered stranger by the doctor's office on his first morning in Sagebrush Flats. Her hands were steady. Her face was focused and calm. He watched her face the entire time she worked, and she knew he was watching, and neither of them addressed it. When she had finished and tied the last knot, she began gathering her things with the quiet efficiency of someone preparing to step back, to create appropriate distance, to return to the sensible arrangement of 2 people who had never quite said the thing that most needed saying. She had decided, somewhere in the long night hours over the preceding weeks, that she would not be the one to reach across that particular distance. She had too much dignity for hope that was not invited, and she had read Joseph Calloway well enough to know that a man like him left. That was what such men did. They solved the problem and they rode on because the road was the only home they trusted. She was reaching for her basket when his hand closed gently around her wrist. Not firmly. Not urgently. The way you hold something you are afraid of losing. She stilled. He stood. He removed his hat with his free hand, that battered, road-worn hat he wore like a second skin, and he held it against his chest. And then, in the middle of the main street of Sagebrush Flats, in the settling dust of a finished reckoning, with the sheriff and his deputies watching and the townspeople emerging cautiously from doorways and windows on every side, Joseph Calloway, the most feared gunslinger in the territory, a man before whom outlaws went pale and sheriffs felt relieved, lowered himself onto one knee. The street went absolutely silent. He looked up at her from that position with those creekwater eyes, and what was in them now was neither cool nor distant. It was clear and open and entirely without armor. "I have ridden into 100 towns," he said, his voice low and unhurried, "and I have never once had a reason to stay. You are my reason, Minsa. You have been my reason since the first morning I saw your hands and your calm and the particular way you make the world gentler than it deserves to be." He paused, steadying himself the way a man steadies himself before the most important thing he has ever attempted. I am not a perfect man. I have dust on my history that won't entirely wash clean. But I am asking you, plainly and completely, if you will let me spend whatever good years I have left proving that I understand what worthy looks like, because I am looking directly at it. Minsa stood above him in the sunlight of a clearing morning. Somewhere behind her, she was distantly aware of Dora's sharp intake of breath, of Lillian's hand finding her husband's arm, of the town watching a story correct itself in real time. She was aware of all of it and interested in none of it. She looked at the man kneeling before her, not kneeling in defeat, not kneeling in performance, but kneeling the way mountains lean toward water, inevitably, honestly, as though the position were the most natural conclusion of everything that had come before it. Her eyes were bright. She did not look away. "Get up, Joseph," she said softly. And then, with the full and quiet warmth of a woman who had waited not out of weakness, but out of absolute certainty that she deserved something real. "And don't ever leave." He rose. His hand found hers. The street breathed again. 3 months later, Joseph Calloway accepted a permanent marshal's position in Sagebrush Flats and broke ground on a plot of land directly adjacent to a homestead with a well-kept garden and a porch that faced west. On clear evenings, 2 figures could be seen sitting on that porch as the sun went down, one with a book, one with his hat in his hands, both watching the frontier stretch golden and endless before them, neither one needing to be anywhere else in the world. The town, which had once whispered about the eldest Caldwell daughter left behind, found other things to talk about. She had always been worth the wait. It had simply taken the right man, on his knees in the dust, to prove it.